The morning had started like 1,000 other mornings for Captain James Mitchell. He'd arrived at Denver International Airport at 5:30 a.m., the sun still a distant promise below the eastern horizon. His crew, co-pilot Sarah Chen, flight attendants Marcus and Angela, plus a cabin crew of 4, gathered for the pre-flight briefing in the operations office. Everything was routine. Everything was perfect. Flight 2847 to Chicago was a regional jet operated by Midwest Airways, a route Mitchell had flown approximately 470 times in his career. The aircraft, a Bombardier CRJ-900, had recently undergone full maintenance. Fuel tanks were topped off. Weather reports showed clear skies all the way to their destination. It was shaping up to be one of those blessed flights where pilots could essentially be passengers, monitoring systems that rarely needed intervention. The boarding process began at 6:15 a.m. 147 passengers filed onto the aircraft, families heading to reunions, business people rushing to meetings, elderly couples visiting grandchildren. Among them was Sarah Chen's 12-year-old son, Marcus, traveling to surprise his father who was based in Chicago. Sarah had managed to secure him a jump seat in the cockpit for the first 20 minutes of flight, a common practice when crew members had children aboard. The boy was quiet, respectful, and genuinely fascinated by aviation. He'd brought a flight simulator game on his laptop, and Sarah knew he spent hours studying procedures that most adults would never bother to understand. Mitchell completed his final walk-around inspection at 6:45 a.m. He ran his hands along the fuselage, checked the tires, examined the engine housings. Everything looked pristine. The aircraft gleamed in the growing morning light, nearly new from its last major overhaul. He felt that familiar anticipatory excitement, the sensation that never quite faded, even after 43 years of flying. That feeling, he would later reflect, was the last moment of his old life. By 7 o'clock, Mitchell was sitting in the left seat, running through the pre-flight checklist with Sarah. Their voices created a practiced rhythm, the verbal exchange between pilots a safety mechanism refined by the aviation industry over decades. "Fuel quantity check," Mitchell said. "Confirmed," Sarah responded, her eyes scanning the green indicators on the fuel panel. Main tank, center tank, and wing tanks all showing full. The numbers were exactly right. The safety systems were exactly right. Everything was exactly right, which is perhaps why the universe decided to throw impossibility at them. The control tower cleared them for taxi at 7:20 a.m. Mitchell gently pushed the throttles forward, and the aircraft began rolling toward the runway. Through the windscreen, the Rocky Mountains rose majestically in the distance, snow-capped peaks that Mitchell had seen thousands of times but never quite stopped appreciating. Sarah handled all radio communications with calm professionalism. In the jump seat behind them, young Marcus watched everything with wide eyes, memorizing details, understanding that he was witnessing something most children never got to experience. Clearance for takeoff came through at 7:35. Mitchell pushed the throttles to full power. The engines roared to life, that powerful crescendo of turbines spinning at thousands of RPM, the sound of controlled combustion that defied the laws of gravity. The aircraft accelerated down the runway, and at the precise moment when airspeed reached rotation velocity, Mitchell pulled back gently on the yoke. The nose lifted. The wheels left the concrete. Flight 2847 was airborne, climbing into the clear Colorado morning toward their cruising altitude of 40,000 feet. The climb was smooth and uneventful. Mitchell hand-flew the aircraft for the first 10 minutes, a practice he preferred, maintaining that crucial connection between pilot and machine that so many younger pilots were losing to automation. Sarah handled the radio calls, acknowledging waypoints and altitude restrictions as air traffic control guided them on their course. Behind them, in the cabin, passengers settled into their seats, some already asleep despite the early hour, others opening laptops or books or simply staring out the windows at the diminishing landscape below. At 40,000 feet, Mitchell engaged the autopilot and sat back in his seat. The aircraft was now at cruise altitude, traveling at 460 knots toward the east. Chicago was 490 miles away, roughly an hour and 10 minutes of flight time. Mitchell allowed himself to relax slightly, that moment where he transitioned from active flying to active monitoring. Sarah ran through the cruise checklist, her finger trailing down the laminated card, verifying every system. All green, all normal, all perfect. At 9:43 a.m., with the aircraft now over the Kansas border, still at 40,000 feet, cruising through crystalline blue sky, something inside the right engine changed. It was a sound first, not an explosion but a subtle change in pitch, a slight irregularity in the normal whine of the turbines. Mitchell's head turned almost instinctively. His brain, trained by 43 years of listening to jet engines, immediately registered that something was wrong. He didn't fully understand what yet, but he knew. Every experienced pilot knows. You develop an almost sixth sense, an intuition built on countless hours of exposure. The sound was wrong. Then came the vibration. The entire aircraft shuddered, a subtle tremor that rippled through the fuselage. Mitchell's hand moved toward the throttle instinctively, beginning to reduce power to the right engine. He was about to radio to Sarah, about to initiate the procedures for engine shutdown, when something miraculous and terrible happened simultaneously. The right engine didn't fail gracefully. It didn't wind down or shut off cleanly. Instead, it catastrophically flamed out, losing all power in the span of a single second. Instruments blinked from green to red. Warnings blared. And then, before Mitchell could even process what was happening, before his mind could catch up with the implications, the left engine did something that should have been impossible. It followed. It died. Both engines, simultaneously, became inert metal hanging from the wings of an aircraft traveling at 380 knots. The silence was absolutely terrifying. For a moment there was nothing but the sound of wind rushing past the fuselage, a high-pitched whistle that filled the cockpit with an eerie, hollow quality. Mitchell stared at the instruments, unable to fully comprehend what he was seeing. 40,000 feet, no engines, 147 people depending on him, and a silence that felt like the world ending. The silence stretched like taffy, bending time into something unrecognizable. Captain James Mitchell's hands moved through muscle memory that had been burned into his nervous system through thousands of hours of training. But his mind, his conscious mind, was struggling with a concept that had been theoretically possible, yet practically impossible his entire career. Dual engine failure. He knew the statistics. He'd studied them in training. The odds were approximately 1 in 10 million for both engines to fail simultaneously from natural causes. Mitchell had never personally encountered it. He'd never met another pilot who had survived it. His right hand moved to the engine start switches. Procedure, always procedure. That's what separated controlled chaos from panic. Sarah Chen, his co-pilot, was staring at the engine indicators with an expression of pure disbelief. Her mouth opened as if to speak, but no words came. In the jump seat, young Marcus had immediately sensed something was catastrophically wrong. The boy's face had drained of color, his youthful confidence replaced by the primal understanding that something beyond normal had just occurred. "Both engines have flamed out," Mitchell announced to Sarah, his voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. Protocol dictated that he verbalize everything, maintaining clear communication even as the world collapsed around them. "I'm initiating restart procedures." Mitchell's fingers found the first engine start switch. In a normal engine failure scenario, the restart procedure was straightforward. You'd reduce altitude, restart the engine at a lower altitude where oxygen was more plentiful, and limp back to an airport. But at 40,000 feet with both engines dead, the mathematics of the situation were different. The air was thin. The temperatures were brutally cold. An engine simply wouldn't restart at this altitude, not under normal circumstances. Not with both engines failing simultaneously from an unknown cause. Sarah's training suddenly kicked in, overriding her shock. Her hands moved across the center console, running through the emergency procedures from memory. "Oxygen masks deployed," she called out, though the passengers wouldn't need them yet. The aircraft could maintain cabin pressure for some time without active engines. But Sarah was thinking ahead, preparing for every possibility. Her pilot's mind was already working through contingencies, calculating how long they had before the lack of pressurization became a factor. Below them, the aircraft had already begun its descent. Without engines producing thrust, the simple law of physics that Isaac Newton had articulated 300 years ago began to reassert its dominance. The aircraft weighed hundreds of thousands of pounds. It was no longer fighting gravity. It was surrendering to gravity, beginning a slow, inexorable slide toward the earth below. The descent wasn't dramatic, not yet. It was more like a feather drifting downward, losing altitude at a rate of about 2,000 feet per minute. But the mathematics of that descent were terrifying when you did the calculation. 40,000 feet of altitude, descending at 2,000 feet per minute. That meant they had approximately 20 minutes before the aircraft reached the ground. 20 minutes to either restart the engines or find an airport where they could land a gliding aircraft. Mitchell's eyes scanned the map displayed on his navigation system. Below them was rural Kansas, vast, empty plains with few airports of any consequence. The nearest major airport was Kansas City International, approximately 200 miles away. At their current descent rate and the forward speed they were maintaining through gravity and wind, that airport was theoretically reachable. But theoretically and practically were two different things entirely. Kansas City Air Traffic Control, Midwest Airways Flight 2847, Sarah's voice crackled across the radio. She'd already switched to the emergency frequency, broadcasting on 121.5, the Universal Distress Channel. "We have experienced dual engine failure, requesting immediate vectors to nearest suitable airport." The response came immediately, but it felt like an eternity passing in the microseconds before the radio transmitted. "Flight 2847, this is Kansas City ATC. We have you on radar, confirming dual engine failure." "Affirmative," Sarah responded, her voice betraying only a slight tremor. "Both engines have flamed out at 40,000 feet, currently descending, attempting restart procedures." On the ground, in the air traffic control facility in Kansas City, 300 miles south of their position, controllers immediately began coordinating what would become one of the most extraordinary emergency operations in modern aviation history. The radio was flooded with calls, alerts being sent to emergency management agencies, fire departments being notified, rescue helicopters being prepared. The phrase "dual engine failure" triggered responses that weren't usually necessary. Most aircraft problems were singular, manageable, survivable, but this was different. This was the nightmare scenario that pilots feared, the scenario that woke them at 3 a.m. in cold sweats. Mitchell tried the engine restart sequence again, knowing it was almost certainly futile. He switched on the ignition systems, prayed to a god he rarely thought about anymore, and waited. Nothing. The instruments remained stubbornly dark, no indication of combustion, no indication of anything except mechanical silence. "Give me every piece of information you have on those engines," Mitchell said to Sarah, his voice clipped but controlled. "I want to know if this is mechanical failure or fuel starvation." Sarah's fingers danced across the keyboard of their flight management computer, pulling up engine diagnostics. Her eyes widened slightly as she studied the data. "Both engines show identical failure signatures," she said slowly. "It's like they both lost fuel at exactly the same moment." Mitchell's mind raced through possibilities. A catastrophic fuel system failure. That seemed almost as unlikely as the engines failing themselves. But something had caused both engines to die simultaneously. Something in those massive fuel tanks, something in those complex fuel lines that provided the lifeblood of jet propulsion. Behind them in the cabin, passengers had begun to notice something was wrong. The engine noise that had been background for an hour was now absent. The vibration was gone. Some passengers were looking at each other with concerned expressions. Others were pressing their faces against windows, trying to understand what was happening. Mitchell reached back and gently closed the cockpit door, then locked it. Whatever was about to happen, he didn't want panic spreading through the cabin. The last thing they needed was 200 passengers experiencing hysteria at 3,000 feet. No, they were down to 32,000 now, the altitude dropping constantly. Kansas City, Flight 2847, Mitchell said, depressing the radio button. We are descending through 32,000 feet. Both engine restart attempts unsuccessful. We are declaring a mayday. The word hung in the air like a curse. Mayday. The international distress signal that meant everything was wrong, that death was a real possibility, that human skill and luck were all that stood between life and catastrophe. Flight 2847, Mayday received, the controller responded. Clearing all traffic in your area. You are cleared to descend to any altitude you require. Every emergency service in a 3-state radius is being activated. You have options. You have time. Fight. Mitchell looked at the altimeter spinning downward. 28,000 feet now. Falling. Always falling. The fight, he realized, had only just begun. In the cabin of Flight 2847, panic was beginning to bubble beneath the surface like steam building in a pressure cooker. The absence of engine noise had registered with the passengers almost immediately. Experienced travelers knew what normal flight sounded like, the constant, reassuring rumble of jet engines that you stopped noticing after about 5 minutes. When that sound disappeared, when it was replaced by an eerie silence punctuated only by wind noise, something ancient and primal in the human brain began sending distress signals. A woman in 14C had grabbed her neighbor's hand. A businessman in 23A was gripping his armrest so tightly his knuckles had turned white. A young mother in 11B was whispering reassurances to her toddler, though her own voice betrayed the terror she was experiencing. Sarah Chen, sitting in the cockpit beside Captain Mitchell, was making a decision that would later be debated by aviation experts for years. She needed to inform the cabin crew of what was happening. Protocol dictated calm, controlled communication, but the flight attendants needed to know. They needed to be prepared for an emergency landing. She activated the intercom system and, in a voice that somehow managed to be both authoritative and reassuring, began to speak. Cabin crew, this is the flight deck. We are experiencing a technical difficulty and will be making an emergency landing at Kansas City International. Please prepare the cabin for landing. Secure all loose items and prepare the emergency equipment. That announcement, more than anything else, transformed the ambient anxiety in the cabin into something more tangible. A technical difficulty, an emergency landing. The passengers understood now. This wasn't normal turbulence. This wasn't a minor mechanical issue that would be fixed at cruising altitude. Something serious was happening. Prayers were whispered. Phone calls were attempted, though at 40,000 feet, cell service was non-existent. Some passengers held hands. Others sat in stunned silence, processing mortality in real time. Young Marcus Chen, sitting in the jump seat in the cockpit, was experiencing something entirely different. While his mother worked through the emergency procedures with mechanical precision, while Captain Mitchell struggled with the terrifying mathematics of a gliding aircraft, Marcus was processing the situation through the lens of a 12-year-old who had spent 2 years immersed in flight simulator software. He understood the physics. He understood the systems. He understood that a dual-engine failure was an almost impossible scenario, which meant something else was causing this. Something in the systems. Something that had a solution. "Mom," Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible beneath the sound of wind rushing past the fuselage. "The fuel crossfeed valve." Sarah didn't hear him. She was focused on the radio communications, on coordinating with air traffic control, on maintaining the mental clarity that was the only thing standing between life and death for everyone aboard. Marcus felt something inside him, something that bypassed logic and training, something that came from somewhere deeper. He knew. In the way that children sometimes know things without understanding how they know them, Marcus understood that the fuel crossfeed valve was the issue. He'd run this scenario in his simulator 100 times. His father had explained it to him in detail during one of their aviation discussions. The fuel crossfeed valve, if malfunctioning, could isolate both engines from fuel even if the main tanks were full. Marcus looked at his mother, at Captain Mitchell, at the instruments spinning and blinking before them. He made a decision that would define his life. He unbuckled his harness from the jump seat. He carefully stood up in the cramped cockpit, moving with deliberate slowness to avoid distracting either pilot at this critical moment. His young mind understood something about adult psychology. If he made sudden movements, if he panicked or cried or demanded attention, he would be sent back to the cabin. Instead, he moved like a ghost, a silent presence in the background. Behind the cockpit, in the forward galley area, Marcus could see the call panel, the intercom system that allowed cabin crew to communicate with the cockpit. It was supposed to be locked during an emergency. But young Marcus, who had explored every inch of this aircraft during the boarding process, had noticed something earlier. The call panel had a secondary radio function, a rarely used feature that allowed crew to broadcast on the main radio channel if the cockpit button was depressed long enough. It was a safety feature, designed for situations where the cockpit crew was incapacitated and cabin crew needed to broadcast a mayday. Marcus's heart was hammering in his chest as he reached for the call panel. He knew he was breaking protocol. He knew that pilots did not appreciate unauthorized voices on the radio. But he also knew, with the absolute certainty of a child who understands something fundamental about physics and systems, that he had information that could save everyone on this aircraft. He depressed the button on the call panel and began to speak. His voice, young and clear, cut through the radio frequency with surprising clarity. "Houston Air Traffic Control, this is Raptor. I can help." In the air traffic control facility in Kansas City, approximately 300 miles to the south, the radio room fell into an absolute silence that was somehow more deafening than any alarm. David Morrison, a controller with 32 years of experience, had heard nearly everything on the radio. Commercial pilots with various accents, military pilots with precise diction, distress calls from aircraft in every conceivable emergency situation. But he had never, in his entire career, heard a child's voice transmit on the emergency frequency. "Repeat last transmission," Morrison said slowly, his hand instinctively moving toward the recording equipment. Everything on the radio was recorded, but now he wanted to make absolutely certain this was being captured. "This is Raptor," the voice came again, clearer now, more confident. "Flight 2847, I am 12 years old. I believe I can help with your engine problem." Morrison's first instinct was to treat this as an emergency situation compounded by an additional problem, that somehow a child had accessed the radio during a critical moment. His second instinct, born from decades of experience reading people through their voices, was to listen. There was something about that voice, something about the clarity, the precision, the absolute confidence that someone so young should not possess. This wasn't a frightened child playing with buttons. This was someone who understood what they were saying. In the cockpit, Sarah Chen's head snapped around. "Captain," she breathed, "a child just transmitted on the radio." Mitchell's eyes widened, but he didn't respond immediately. His mind was still processing the crisis in front of him. The aircraft was at 28,000 feet now and descending. Kansas City was still nearly 200 miles away. The fuel system was still inoperative, but something in his experienced pilot's mind, something that couldn't be explained by logic, made him listen to that small voice coming through the speaker. "Raptor, you have Flight 2847 listening," Morrison said carefully, speaking to the child as one would speak to anyone whose voice they heard, with respect, with attention, with the understanding that information, regardless of its source, might be valuable. What is your name, and what information do you have? My name is Marcus Chen, the boy's voice responded. I am the son of co-pilot Sarah Chen, and I think I know why both engines failed. The words hung in the cockpit and in the control room like a benediction, like a sudden shaft of light breaking through impossible darkness. The cockpit of Flight 2847 seemed to compress around the four people inside it. Captain James Mitchell, co-pilot Sarah Chen, young Marcus Chen standing in the narrow space between the seats, and the invisible presence of David Morrison's voice coming through the speaker. The aircraft had descended to 26,000 feet, and the altitude numbers were spinning downward with relentless precision. Mitchell's training told him to dismiss this, to send the boy back to the cabin, to focus entirely on the adults who knew what they were doing. But there was something in the way Marcus had spoken, something in the scientific certainty embedded in his young voice, that made Mitchell pause. Marcus, Sarah said, her voice containing a mix of shock and maternal concern, what are you doing up here? You should be in your seat. I know, Mom, Marcus responded, and there was no trace of a child's fear in his voice. Instead, there was only focused determination. But I understand what happened to the engines. The fuel crossfeed valve. It's in the wrong position. Both engines are isolated from fuel. Mitchell's hands, which had been moving through the emergency procedures with automatic precision, suddenly stilled. His mind locked onto those words, the fuel crossfeed valve. It was a component he understood intellectually, a mechanism he'd studied in training, but rarely had to actually deal with in practice. The crossfeed valve was a safety device that allowed pilots to manually direct fuel from one tank to another if a primary system failed. Under normal circumstances, it remained in a neutral position, automatically balanced. But if something went wrong, if the valve became stuck or misaligned, it could actually prevent fuel from reaching the engines even when the main tanks were completely full. How do you know this? Mitchell asked, his pilot's mind grappling with the improbability of receiving critical technical information from a child. Dad explained it to me, Marcus said quickly, his eyes darting between the engine gauges and the fuel panel. During our last visit, he said it was one of the most dangerous situations a pilot could face because the problem doesn't show up in the normal fuel quantity gauges. The tanks read full, but the engines still starve. I've run this scenario in my simulator 100 times. Through the speaker, David Morrison's voice cut through. Captain Mitchell, this is Kansas City ATC. We're monitoring this transmission. Flight 2847, what is your assessment? Mitchell exchanged a glance with Sarah. Her expression was a mixture of concern and something else, a desperate hope. They were out of options. They were descending toward Earth with no engines and limited time. What could it hurt to listen to a 12-year-old who apparently understood aeronautical systems better than most flight attendants? Marcus, Mitchell said carefully, speaking as one professional to another, if the fuel crossfeed valve is stuck in the wrong position, how would we reset it? The manual override switch is on the panel to your right, Marcus said immediately, pointing a small finger toward a section of the instrument panel that Mitchell had looked at hundreds of times without really seeing. It's marked as FCF manual override. You have to switch it from auto to manual, then cycle it through each position, forward, neutral, aft, then back to neutral. Mitchell's eyes found the switch. It was small, unmarked except for the abbreviation that meant nothing to most people but everything to someone who understood the systems. His hand moved toward it instinctively, then hesitated. This felt wrong. This felt like following instructions from a child about systems that controlled the lives of 147 people. But the alternative, doing nothing, continuing to descend toward Kansas with dead engines, was far worse than the risk of trying something unconventional. Sarah, Mitchell said, turning to his co-pilot, verify the fuel system schematic. Check if the fuel crossfeed valve could cause this symptom. Sarah's fingers flew across the touchscreen of her flight management system. Her eyes scanned the complex diagrams showing fuel lines, fuel tanks, pumps, and valves in the intricate ballet of systems that kept jet engines running. Her face went pale as the realization struck her. "Oh my God," she whispered. "The symptoms match perfectly if the crossfeed valve is stuck in the isolated position." She didn't finish the sentence. The implication was clear. Both engines would be starved of fuel exactly as they were experiencing now. "Marcus," Mitchell said, and there was something different in his voice now, a tone that suggested he was speaking to someone whose knowledge demanded respect. "When I cycle this switch, what should I expect?" "The fuel flow should resume almost immediately once you get it into the correct position," Marcus said. "The engines might take a few seconds to restart because of the altitude, but the fuel will be available. Then you need to work on getting them to actually catch." Mitchell took a deep breath. The aircraft was at 22,000 feet now. Every second that passed was another 1,000 feet of altitude surrendered to gravity. He looked at the switch one more time, then reached out and grasped it. The small piece of plastic and metal seemed to contain the entire weight of his responsibility, the entire weight of 147 lives resting on whether he was trusting the right information. "Flight 2847, attempting fuel crossfeed valve reset," Mitchell announced on the radio for the control center to hear, to record, to document. "Manual override switch engaged." He moved the switch from its current position to forward. Nothing happened immediately. The engine instruments remained dark. No indication of fuel flow, no indication of anything. For a horrible moment, Mitchell wondered if they'd been wrong, if Marcus had been mistaken, if following the advice of a child had been a catastrophic error. "Try aft position," Marcus said urgently. "That's where it should be when the automatic system fails." Mitchell's hand moved again. Forward, neutral, aft. The switch clicked into position. For a moment, nothing. And then the fuel flow indicators on the engine panel suddenly flickered to life. The needles jumped from 0 to normal operating values. It was as if someone had suddenly opened a valve in the sky itself, as if fuel that had been impossibly present but inaccessible was now suddenly available to the starving engines. "Fuel flow restored," Sarah shouted, her voice cracking with emotion. "Both engines showing fuel available." In the cabin, passengers noticed the change immediately. The wind noise that had been their only companion for terrifying minutes seemed to diminish slightly as the aircraft's descent rate changed. The uncontrolled glide was becoming something different, something more manageable. "Attempting engine restart," Mitchell said, and his hands moved to the ignition switches. He was simultaneously terrified that this wouldn't work and exhilarated that they finally had a chance. At 20,000 feet, with fuel now available and ignition systems engaged, the right engine sputtered. Once, twice, and then, with a sound like a dragon awakening from an ancient sleep, it roared to life. Alarms that had been screaming suddenly quieted. The vibration that had been absent from the aircraft returned, but now it wasn't a sign of failure. It was a sign of hope. "Right engine live," Sarah announced. "Left engine showing fuel flow and ignition engaged." Marcus stood quietly between the seats, his young face a mask of concentration. He was holding his breath, Mitchell realized. This 12-year-old boy was holding his breath, understanding completely what the next seconds would mean for everyone aboard. The left engine caught. The second turbine roared to life, and suddenly the cockpit was filled with the sound of redemption. The roar of both engines coming to life was more than just the sound of mechanical systems restarting. It was the sound of possibility, of hope crystallized into raw power. Both turbines were now spinning at normal operating RPMs, consuming fuel at the rate they were designed to consume it, providing the thrust that would transform a descending aircraft into something that could actually fly. Captain Mitchell felt tears forming in the corners of his eyes, something that hadn't happened to him since his daughter was born 35 years ago. The mathematics of survival had suddenly shifted. Where moments before there had been only a descending glide ending in disaster, now there was actual propulsion, actual control, actual chance. Both engines nominal, Sarah reported, her voice trembling slightly despite her professional training. All systems showing green. The aircraft had descended to 18,000 feet during the critical moments of engine restart. The Kansas City airport, their target, was still 180 miles away. At their current airspeed and altitude, that meant approximately 18 minutes of flight time, 18 minutes of actual powered flight, with engines burning fuel, with real control surfaces managing the aircraft's trajectory. The mathematics now worked in their favor instead of against them. For the first time since the right engine had sputtered and died at 40,000 feet, Mitchell allowed himself to believe that they might actually survive this. Flight 2847, Kansas City ATC. Morrison's voice came through the speaker, and even the professional controller's voice betrayed the emotion of the moment. We are reading both engines nominal. You are cleared to descend to any altitude you require. All emergency services are standing by. You have a full emergency vector to Kansas City International. Welcome back to the world of powered flight. Mitchell wiped his eyes quickly, a gesture that was more emotional than his entire career had been until this moment. Kansas City, Flight 2847. Thank you. We owe our lives to a young man aboard this aircraft. Through the speaker came a new voice, a voice that carried the weight of decades of experience. David Morrison had made a decision in that air traffic control facility, a decision that would be debated by aviation authorities for years to come. He had summoned Robert Patterson from the break room. Patterson, 73 years old, retired after 42 years as a test pilot and instructor, happened to be visiting the facility for historical reasons. Morrison had given him a rapid briefing on the situation. Dual engine failure, now corrected, aircraft with 147 people aboard needing guidance for an emergency landing. Flight 2847, this is retired test pilot Robert Patterson in the Kansas City ATC facility, the new voice announced. I understand you have a remarkable young man aboard who provided technical guidance. Young man, can you hear me? Marcus, still standing between the seats in the cockpit, his eyes wide with the understanding that he'd just done something that defied explanation, heard his name being addressed by a voice that carried absolute authority and calm competence. Yes, sir, he responded. I'm here. Your name? Patterson asked. Marcus Chen, sir. I'm 12 years old. There was a pause, just a brief one, but it seemed to contain entire conversations. Patterson, who had trained hundreds of pilots, who had worked with military aviators, who had spent 4 decades teaching people how to survive impossible situations, was speaking to a child who had just demonstrated knowledge and presence of mind that most adult pilots would struggle to achieve. Marcus, Patterson said slowly, I am going to help Captain Mitchell and Officer Chen land this aircraft, but I need you to be my eyes on the instruments. Are you willing to do that? Yes, sir, Marcus said immediately. What followed over the next 18 minutes was an unprecedented collaboration between a 73-year-old retired test pilot speaking from an air traffic control facility, an experienced captain flying with both engines now functional but the aircraft still in a state of emergency, a co-pilot managing complex systems and communications, and a 12-year-old boy reading instruments with a clarity and precision that would have been remarkable at any age, much less his own. Patterson, understanding intuitively what Marcus represented, began to structure his guidance around the boy's capabilities. Marcus, I need you to read me the altitude, airspeed, and descent rate every 30 seconds. Can you do that? 17,000 feet, 340 knots, descending at 1,200 feet per minute, Marcus reported immediately. Good, Patterson said. Captain Mitchell, maintain that descent rate. We want a gradual, controlled descent that will put you at 2,000 feet, approximately 20 miles from the airport. Marcus, keep those readings coming. As the aircraft continued its descent toward Kansas City, a strange intimacy developed in the cockpit. Sarah Chen, the professional co-pilot and Marcus's mother, found herself partnered with her own son in a way that transcended the normal parent-child relationship. She was witnessing her child operating under pressure with a capability that suggested he'd been born to do this. At one point, when Captain Mitchell needed to run a systems check that required momentary distraction, it was Marcus who maintained awareness of the altitude and descent rate, calling out numbers with the precision of someone who understood that lives depended on accuracy. Patterson, meanwhile, was providing the kind of guidance that only someone with decades of test pilot experience could offer. He wasn't just walking them through standard procedures. He was thinking several steps ahead, anticipating potential problems, preparing contingencies. Flight 2847, be aware that your descent into Kansas City will bring you through cloud layers starting at 8,000 feet. Prepare for instrument-only approach into final landing. The aircraft broke through 15,000 feet, then 12,000. The landscape below was becoming visible now, the vast, rolling plains of Kansas stretching toward the horizon. But they weren't there yet. The critical moment was still ahead of them. The actual landing, the moment when 147 people would transition from an aircraft in emergency to passengers who had survived an impossible crisis. Flight 2847, frequency change to final approach control, Morrison's voice crackled through. Kansas City final, 119.5. Mitchell switched frequencies, and suddenly they were connected to a different set of controllers, people who specialized in bringing damaged aircraft to the ground safely. But before Mitchell could even call out, Patterson's voice came through on the new frequency. Flight 2847, Robert Patterson monitoring on this frequency as well. Marcus, I want you to give me constant altitude and airspeed updates for the next 5 minutes. Captain Mitchell, we're going to execute the most textbook approach you've ever flown. No heroics, just precision. For the next 5 minutes, the world contracted to the cockpit of Flight 2847, Marcus's voice calling out numbers, Patterson's voice providing guidance, Sarah managing systems with mechanical precision, Mitchell's hands steady on the controls, guiding the aircraft toward its salvation. At 6,000 feet, they broke through the cloud layer and the runway came into view, a long, concrete strip lined with emergency vehicles, fire trucks with lights flashing, ambulances positioned at intervals along the taxiway. Every emergency resource in Kansas City had been mobilized. Every rescue team was standing by. Flight 2847, Kansas City final, you are cleared for straighten approach, runway 19 right, the final approach controller announced. All emergency equipment is standing by. The aircraft continued its descent, 5,000 feet, 4,000, 3,000. Below them, the runway was growing larger, more real, more tangible with each passing second. This was it. This was the moment that would define whether this was a story of tragedy or triumph. Marcus, Patterson's voice came one final time. Read me those numbers one last time. 2,000 feet, 280 knots, descent rate 800 feet per minute, Marcus said, his young voice steady as stone. Perfect, Patterson said. Captain Mitchell, you're going home. Final approach to Kansas City International Airport stretched before them like a ribbon of salvation, concrete and steel representing the difference between life and death. Captain Mitchell's hands were steady on the yoke, but inside his chest, his heart was performing acrobatics that would have alarmed any cardiologist. The aircraft was at 3,000 feet now, descending at a controlled rate, both engines burning fuel and producing the thrust that made all of this possible. Yet somewhere in the back of his mind, Mitchell couldn't shake the memory of those engines failing, couldn't forget the terrifying silence that had gripped the cockpit just minutes earlier. Sarah Chen was managing the final approach checklist with the precision of someone performing surgery. Each item called out, each response confirmed. Landing gear down, 3 green lights indicating locked positions. Flaps extended to approach configuration, instruments confirming the aerodynamic change in the aircraft's profile. Flight control surfaces tested and verified. Every system that could be checked was being checked, because both pilots understood that they had been given a second chance, and they would not squander it through negligence or oversight. Behind them, in the cabin, the passengers were experiencing their own version of the descent. Many had been terrified into absolute silence, staring out windows or at the seat in front of them, processing the reality that they had survived something that statistics suggested should have killed them. A woman in 8A was praying quietly in Mandarin, her rosary beads clicking through her fingers in an ancient rhythm that transcended language. The businessman in 23A had opened his laptop and was writing, documenting his thoughts before they evaporated, a final message to his family written, in the assumption that this might be his last opportunity to communicate. A college student in 15C was video calling his mother on the airplane's Wi-Fi, the connection having finally stabilized, tears streaming down his face as he reassured her that he was still alive. The emergency vehicles lined the runway below were a sight that would have been comforting under normal circumstances. But to Mitchell and Sarah, they represented something else, a testament to the seriousness of their situation, a visual representation of how close they had come to catastrophe. Fire trucks with their lights painting the tarmac in urgent reds and whites, ambulances positioned at regular intervals, rescue personnel in protective gear standing by. All of it arranged in preparation for a crash that they had managed to prevent. Flight 2847, descending through 2,500 feet, Sarah reported to Kansas City final approach. Both engines nominal, all systems green, landing gear down and locked. Flight 2847, continue your descent, the controller responded. Runway 19 right is clear and ready for your arrival. You are number 1 for landing. Mitchell was beginning to feel the aircraft's response to his inputs differently now. Where minutes ago, the controls had felt heavy and sluggish, the resistance of a gliding aircraft fighting gravity and wind, now they responded with alacrity. The engines provided power that allowed him to manage pitch, rate of descent, and approach angle with precision. This was normal flying. This was what he had trained for his entire career. The fact that it felt miraculous was simply a testament to how close they had come to losing it forever. Young Marcus remained standing between the seats, still providing instrument readings to Robert Patterson, who was monitoring every aspect of their descent from the ground. The boy's voice had become almost hypnotic in its regularity. Altitude, airspeed, descent rate, repeated at intervals, each number a confirmation that they were still alive, still descending in a controlled manner, still on track for a landing that would save everyone aboard. 2,000 feet, 260 knots, descent rate 600 feet per minute, Marcus called out. Patterson's voice came through the speaker with unwavering calm. Excellent. You are on profile, Captain. Maintain current descent rate. Runway is in sight. Affirmative, Mitchell responded. Runway is in sight, visual approach now. The transition from instrument flying to visual flying brought a subtle shift in the cockpit. Mitchell's eyes, which had been focused on the instruments providing electronic representations of the aircraft's flight path, now locked onto the actual physical reality of the runway spreading out before them. He could see the runway markings, the numbered designation that indicated which runway they were landing on, the perspective lines that would guide him to a touchdown zone that was precisely calculated for the aircraft's landing distance. Sarah's voice continued its rhythmic calling of checklist items. Landing checklist complete, all systems nominal, cabin prepared for landing, doors armed for emergency evacuation. The aircraft was now at 1,500 feet, and the physics of the situation had shifted into a domain that Mitchell had performed hundreds of times. The normal calculations of descent angle, airspeed management, and touchdown point estimation. But nothing about this landing was normal. Every passenger aboard was aware that they had experienced something extraordinary. Every crew member understood the weight of responsibility being executed in real time. At 1,000 feet, Mitchell extended the flaps fully, transforming the aircraft's configuration one final time. The drag increased, allowing the aircraft to descend at a steeper angle while maintaining a safe airspeed. Below them, the emergency vehicles seemed to be watching, waiting, ready to respond if anything went wrong in these final moments. 1,000 feet, Marcus reported. 500 feet, Marcus reported moments later. The runway was massive now, impossibly large, filling the windscreen with the reality of landing. Mitchell could see the individual runway lights, could distinguish the painted markings that indicated the touchdown zone. His hands were absolutely steady, his mind locked into the singular focus required for a precision landing. 250 feet, Marcus's voice came again. Mitchell began to transition the aircraft's attitude, reducing the descent rate even further, preparing for the moment when the wheels would make contact with the concrete below. The aircraft was behaving perfectly, responding to his inputs with the smoothness of a machine that had been designed and engineered by thousands of intelligent people across decades of development. 100 feet, Marcus reported. The runway was directly beneath them now. Mitchell could feel the subtle shift in air currents as the aircraft approached ground effect, that aerodynamic phenomenon where proximity to the Earth changes how the aircraft flies, providing slightly more lift and requiring adjustment to landing technique. 50 feet, Marcus said, his voice somehow still perfectly calm despite the reality that they were moments away from touchdown. Mitchell began the flare, the gradual reduction of descent rate that would transform the aircraft's trajectory from descending to horizontal. The nose came up slightly. The descent rate continued to decrease. The runway below was now so close that it filled his entire field of vision. 30 feet. The landing gear was about to make contact. Mitchell could feel it in the aircraft, could sense the exact moment when the wheels would kiss the concrete. His hands made minute adjustments, microscopically fine-tuning pitch and descent rate. 10 feet. And then, with a gentleness that seemed impossible given the circumstances, the aircraft made contact. The landing gear touched the runway with a whisper of hydraulic pressure and rubber meeting concrete. The wheels engaged. The aircraft was no longer flying. It was rolling, decelerating, traveling down a runway with 147 souls aboard who had just been granted another chance at life. The cabin erupted. Screaming, crying, cheering, prayers of thanksgiving in a dozen different languages, passengers embracing strangers, a young woman standing up and announcing to no one in particular that she was going to change her entire life, an elderly man pressing his face against the window, tears streaming down his wrinkled face as he watched the emergency vehicles rolling alongside them. Captain Mitchell allowed the aircraft to decelerate naturally. The reverse thrusters engaged, the aircraft's forward momentum slowly bleeding away until finally, gently, the aircraft came to a complete stop on the runway of Kansas City International Airport. For a moment there was silence. And then the true celebration began. The silence lasted only seconds before it was shattered by the most beautiful sound Captain James Mitchell had ever heard, the screaming of brakes as the aircraft decelerated along the runway. The reverse thrusters howled their mechanical song, slowing the massive aircraft from landing speed to taxi speed, from the desperate emergency that had defined the past hour to something approaching normalcy. But normalcy was a relative term in the cockpit of Flight 2847. Nothing would ever be normal again, not for anyone aboard this aircraft, not after experiencing the edge of oblivion and being pulled back by measures that defied the normal boundaries of human experience. The aircraft came to rest approximately 8,000 feet down the runway, positioned exactly where Mitchell intended it to be. The emergency vehicles that had been lined up in anticipation of catastrophe immediately swarmed around them. Fire trucks, ambulances, rescue vehicles, all moving with practiced coordination despite the extraordinary nature of what they were about to encounter. Mitchell killed the engines. The steady roar of the turbines that had carried them from death's doorstep fell silent one final time, replaced by the whine of auxiliary power that would maintain the aircraft's systems while they remained on the ground. Flight 2847, wheels stop, Kansas City ATC, the controller announced, his voice carrying the weight of relief that only someone who had monitored an emergency from the ground could possess. Welcome to the runway. Congratulations, Captain Mitchell. That was the finest piece of piloting I have witnessed in 30 years of controlling aircraft. Mitchell's hands were shaking now, the adrenaline that had sustained him through the emergency finally releasing its grip on his physiology. He looked at Sarah and saw his own emotion reflected in her eyes, relief, gratitude, and the overwhelming awareness of how close they had come to a different ending entirely. In the jump seat, young Marcus had finally unbuckled himself and was looking out at the sea of emergency vehicles surrounding them with the wondering expression of a child who had just done something extraordinary without fully understanding the implications. Kansas City, Flight 2847, Mitchell responded, his voice hoarse from hours of tension despite the flight being only 90 minutes in duration. Thank you, and thank you to everyone who provided guidance. We couldn't have made it without you. The cabin doors opened, and suddenly, Flight 2847 transformed from an aircraft in an emergency state to a vessel of humanity processing survival. The flight attendants who had been secured in their jump seats throughout the landing now moved into the cabin, beginning the process of evacuating the aircraft using the stairs that had been wheeled up to the fuselage. The emergency slides were not deployed. This was a controlled evacuation, not a crash landing. But the passengers moved with the urgency of people who had experienced something that made them acutely aware of their own mortality. The first passenger to exit the aircraft was an elderly woman who had been in seat 3A. She stepped out onto the stairs and immediately knelt down, pressing her forehead against the metal step in a gesture of pure thanksgiving. Behind her, other passengers followed, their faces bearing expressions that ranged from stunned gratitude to overwhelming emotion to the thousand-yard stare of people processing extreme trauma. Some were crying, some were smiling. Some were both simultaneously, as if their nervous systems couldn't decide which emotion was appropriate, and so were cycling through all of them at once. Emergency medical personnel moved through the aircraft, checking every passenger, assessing for injuries, not from the landing, which had been textbook perfect, but from the psychological trauma of the preceding hour. A young mother clutched her toddler to her chest so tightly that the medical personnel had to gently separate them for assessment. The businessman who had been writing his final message had disconnected from his video call and was now standing in the aisle, staring at his hands as if he couldn't quite believe they still belonged to him. The college student who had been reassuring his mother was being wrapped in a thermal blanket despite the Kansas heat, his body responding to psychological shock with the physical symptoms of hypothermia. In the cockpit, Captain Mitchell was completing the shutdown procedures with Sarah by his side. The discipline of aviation procedure demanded that even in moments of extraordinary relief, the proper steps be followed, the proper systems be secured, the proper documentation be maintained. Mitchell's hands moved through the shutdown sequence almost without conscious thought, but each action grounded him, anchored him in the reality that the emergency was genuinely over. Robert Patterson's voice came through the radio one final time. Flight 2847, this is Robert Patterson. That was extraordinary flying, Captain. And young Marcus, outstanding work on the instrument readings. You have the makings of an excellent pilot if you choose to pursue it. Marcus, who was now moving toward the cabin door to exit the aircraft, paused at those words. He looked back at Captain Mitchell and Sarah, and in that moment, something shifted in the boy's understanding of himself. He had always been interested in aviation. He had spent hours in simulators, but he had never conceived of himself as a pilot. He had been a child playing with toys. But now, with those words from a legendary test pilot ringing in his ears, he was beginning to understand that perhaps his future held possibilities he had never quite articulated. The evacuation continued in orderly fashion. 147 passengers exiting an aircraft that had been moments away from becoming a tomb, each person stepping out onto American soil with the peculiar gratitude that only someone who thought they were about to lose their life could possibly feel. Some kissed the ground. Some fell to their knees. Some simply stood there, breathing air that they had been certain they would not breathe for much longer. Captain Mitchell and Sarah emerged from the cockpit last, moving through the cabin that was now empty except for the emergency personnel still performing their assessments. Mitchell looked at the seats where his passengers had been sitting, at the evidence of their fear: abandoned personal items, magazines torn to shreds by nervous hands, a child's teddy bear left behind in the scramble to evacuate. He picked up the teddy bear and held it, understanding that somewhere, a child would be looking for this small comfort object, and he would make certain it was returned. Outside, the tarmac was pandemonium in the best possible sense. News crews that had been positioned at the airport for the emergency landing now had their cameras rolling, capturing every moment of the aftermath. Emergency medical personnel were assessing passengers, though remarkably, aside from psychological trauma, there were no serious injuries. The fact that they had landed intact, that the emergency had been resolved at altitude before it became a crash, meant that 147 people were walking away from this experience with their lives intact and their bodies fundamentally unhurt. Captain Mitchell stood at the base of the aircraft stairs, still holding the teddy bear, and surveyed the scene before him. The fire trucks and ambulances, the news crews, the passengers being attended to by emergency medical personnel, the colleagues who were now rushing toward him, his airline's operations managers, airline officials, people who wanted to understand how a dual-engine failure at 40,000 feet had not become a tragedy. But Mitchell's attention was fixed on one figure making his way through the controlled chaos. It was Sarah, who had exited the aircraft moments after him, and beside her was Marcus. The boy who had saved 147 lives was simply standing there, looking at the enormity of the emergency vehicles and personnel that had been mobilized for their survival, and Mitchell could see that the full weight of what had occurred was beginning to settle on the boy's shoulders. Mitchell walked across the tarmac toward them, still holding the teddy bear, understanding that this moment, standing on the ground with both engines silent, with passengers alive and accounted for, with a crisis resolved through knowledge and courage and an extraordinary collaboration between an experienced captain, a professional co-pilot, a 73-year-old test pilot, and a 12-year-old boy. This moment would define his career, his life, and the lives of everyone who had been aboard Flight 2847, the Federal Aviation Administration's investigation into Flight 2847 lasted for 6 months. Every system was examined. Every component was tested. Every decision made in the cockpit was scrutinized by engineers, pilots, and aviation specialists who understood that the outcome of this crisis, survival instead of catastrophe, represented an anomaly that demanded complete understanding. The preliminary findings confirmed what Captain Mitchell and co-pilot Chen had concluded during those terrifying minutes at altitude. The fuel crossfeed valve had malfunctioned due to a manufacturing defect that had escaped detection during routine maintenance. A microscopic imperfection in the valve's solenoid mechanism had caused it to stick in the isolated position, preventing fuel from reaching the engines despite both main tanks being completely full. The statistics were staggering. In normal circumstances, a dual-engine failure at 40,000 feet with an unknown cause had a survival rate below 5%. The aircraft would descend beyond the point where engines could be restarted. The descent rate would make it impossible to reach an airport. The physics of gravity would be inexorable. But Flight 2847 had beaten those odds through a combination of factors that the FAA's report ultimately characterized as an extraordinary convergence of expertise, presence of mind, and circumstantial advantage. Captain Mitchell's experience had provided the foundational knowledge. Sarah Chen's precision had maintained the aircraft's systems. And Marcus Chen's technical knowledge had identified a solution that should have been beyond the reasonable capability of his age and experience level. The media, however, had a different narrative. By the time the aircraft had come to rest on the Kansas City runway, news of a 12-year-old boy who had helped save 147 lives had already spread across the internet. Within hours, Marcus Chen was a national story. Within days, he was an international phenomenon. News outlets competed for exclusive interviews. Talk show hosts offered enormous sums for appearances. Documentary filmmakers contacted his family with proposals for feature-length explorations of the event. Marcus, who had been an ordinary sixth-grade student living in Denver just 24 hours earlier, suddenly found himself thrust into a level of celebrity that would have been disorienting for an adult, much less a child. The FAA initially sought to downplay Marcus's role in the emergency resolution. The official narrative favored the expertise of Captain Mitchell and the guidance of Robert Patterson, reducing Marcus's contribution to that of a passive observer who happened to have flight simulator knowledge. But the detailed transcripts of the emergency communications, released to the media through Freedom of Information Act requests, told a different story entirely. Those transcripts showed a child speaking with absolute clarity, providing critical technical information at precisely the moments when that information was most essential, maintaining composure under circumstances that would have caused most adults to collapse into panic. Captain James Mitchell changed that narrative. In his official testimony before the National Transportation Safety Board, Mitchell refused to minimize Marcus's contribution. He spoke about the moment when Marcus had identified the fuel crossfeed valve as the issue, about the clarity and precision with which the boy had communicated technical information, about the fact that without Marcus's intervention, he and Sarah would still have been running through standard emergency procedures while the aircraft descended toward disaster. That boy, Mitchell testified, his voice steady but emotional, saved every person aboard that aircraft. I have spent 43 years flying, and I have never encountered a situation where an untrained 12-year-old demonstrated the capability to understand a complex aeronautical system well enough to guide a captain through a life-or-death emergency. Marcus Chen is not a passenger who happened to know something useful. Marcus Chen is a hero. The statement reverberated through aviation communities, through engineering communities, through communities of parents trying to raise children with the kind of knowledge and presence of mind that Marcus had demonstrated. Schools across America added aviation components to their science curricula. Flight simulator software companies experienced a surge in sales. Parents began encouraging their children to engage with complex technical subjects in ways they previously had not. Marcus Chen, entirely unwillingly, had become the face of what was possible when young people were given access to knowledge and encouraged to develop mastery. Sarah Chen made a different kind of statement. In interviews with aviation media, she spoke about being a mother and a professional pilot simultaneously, about the pride she felt witnessing her son operate under extraordinary pressure, about the understanding that children often possess capabilities and knowledge that adults underestimate. She also spoke about the guilt she initially felt, the guilt of not knowing that her son had ventured into the cockpit during the emergency, the guilt of not being able to protect him from the intensity of what was happening, the guilt of having her professional competence and her maternal responsibility operating in direct tension during those critical minutes. Captain Mitchell and Sarah Chen remained in contact with Robert Patterson after the emergency. The retired test pilot, who had been prepared to spend his final years in quiet retirement, found himself invited to speak at aviation conferences, to consult on training programs, to mentor young pilots who had been inspired by the story of Flight 2847. Patterson, now 83 years old, spoke frequently about the moment when he made the decision to trust a 12-year-old boy's technical input. In that moment, Patterson would tell audiences, I was forced to confront my own biases about age and capability. I had spent 4 decades assuming that expertise came with years of experience. But Flight 2847 taught me that expertise is something entirely different. It's understanding, presence of mind, and the willingness to act decisively when knowledge demands action. Marcus Chen had all 3 qualities in abundance. Marcus Chen returned to his Denver middle school the week after the emergency landing. He was not treated as a hero by his classmates, at least not in the way the media was treating him. Instead, he experienced something more complex, a mixture of awe, envy, resentment, and fascination. His teachers struggled with how to integrate him back into normal classroom life when he had just demonstrated capabilities that most of them would never develop. His parents, particularly his father, who was himself a commercial pilot, worked deliberately to help Marcus understand that what he had done was extraordinary, but that his value as a person had not been dependent on that extraordinary act. For Sarah and her husband, Marcus's father, the experience became a catalyst for deeper conversations about parenting, about childhood, about the expectations they held for their son. They worked to ensure that Marcus remained a child, that he attended school like other 6th graders, that he had time for play and rest, and the kinds of unstructured experiences that childhood demanded. But they also supported his genuine passion for aviation, ensuring that he had access to mentorship, to advanced flight simulator training, to the kind of technical education that his interests demanded. 5 years later, at 17 years old, Marcus Chen obtained his pilot's license. He was one of the youngest commercial pilots in the United States. His first official act as a licensed pilot was to co-pilot a flight from Denver to Chicago with Captain James Mitchell, who had spent 5 years mentoring the young man, teaching him everything that an official flight training program could not. As they reached cruising altitude, Mitchell looked over at Marcus sitting in the co-pilot's seat and reflected on the journey that had brought them from that terrifying moment at 40,000 feet to this peaceful cruising flight. The story of Flight 2847 became more than just a narrative of extraordinary survival. It became a testimony to human potential, to the unexpected sources of expertise, to the power of knowledge and training to transcend age and experience. Marcus Chen had saved 147 lives not because he was special or superhuman, but because he had been given access to knowledge, encouraged to develop mastery, and had possessed the courage to act when that knowledge was needed. The fuel crossfeed valve that had caused the emergency was eventually redesigned and improved by aviation manufacturers around the world. The failure mechanism that had trapped both engines without fuel would never happen again. And somewhere in a museum dedicated to aviation history, a small teddy bear sits in a glass case, a reminder of the journey of 147 people who thought they were about to die, but instead discovered that sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected places, and often from the voice of a child willing to speak truth in the face of impossible circumstances.